Ye keci pāṇabhūtatthi, tasā thāvarā vanavasesā. Dīghā yeva mahantā, majjhimā rassakā aṇukathūlā. Whatever beings which exist, be they weak or strong, without exception, long or great, middle-sized, small, the minute and the bulky. So this verse continues in the spirit of the second line of verse 3, and this verse begins with the word yea, which introduces a relative clause. Now normally I would advise looking for the main clause first, but that is slightly tricky in this case, so let's start with this little clause here, and then we'll talk about the context. So the way I would break this apart, and the way I make sense of this clause, is to actually start with keci. Now we had before the word kinchi, and we noticed that this chi phoneme transforms this interrogative pronoun into an indefinite. So K here would be masculine nominative plural, meaning like what beings or whatever is under discussion that's masculine nominative. Here beings. So it would mean something like what beings. But with the addition of chi, we get whatever. And then we have pāṇabhūtatthi. This actually breaks apart into pāṇabhūta, which is a compound, and then the word atti. We're going to deal with atti in a minute. Let's look at pāṇabhūta. That is, as I said, a compound of pāṇa, which is related to the Sanskrit word prana, kind of like the breath of life. So pāṇa means a living being, maybe a being that breathes. And then bhuta, being the past participle of bhavati, to be, has many, many meanings, including like ghosts or kind of like nature, that which exists. But in this particular case, it just means beings, just like pāṇa. And it really seems as if when these two words are brought together, they really just mean beings. So it could be that the compound is used because of metrical reasons. It could be that the Buddha is trying to be absolutely inclusive, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. Now, this word has been run together with atti. If that were not the case, if it stood on its own, it would actually be pāṇabhūta, masculine nominative plural. And when you put that with keci, it would mean whatever living beings. And then I would double back and pick up the ye, our relative pronoun, also masculine nominative plural, which, and then we go to atti. Now, atti is third person singular, present active indicative, and it's from the root us, to be. That would be as, not us, as in us. Us, the verb to be. Now you might think, why on earth do we have a third person singular verb here when we have a plural subject? And the answer to that is a good question. So there could be many reasons, and actually we don't need to go into the reasons right now. We can actually consult the commentary where they gloss this. They say atiti, and then they just say santi sangvijanti. Santi would be just the third person singular, or the third person plural, present active indicative from the same root. Or sangvijanti, which means to exist. So it is meant to go with the nominative plural. I can't really address exactly why. In poetry, I just usually use a vague statement like, for reasons of the meter. And this issue of the meter will come up again in just a minute. So one issue here is that if we look beyond this clause that we just dealt with, we'll notice that there's not a verb in sight. It will make sense translating it that way if we understand this in context. If we just pulled this verse out of context, it wouldn't make a ton of sense. But then actually any sentence kind of taken out of its larger context won't make a great deal of sense. Another way to kind of say what I said there is, if we look at the end of this verse, there is an actual period. But this type of punctuation was added much, much, much later. These verses, the entire canon, the entire Pali canon was transmitted orally for centuries. So even being written down was later, and I think the punctuation even later than that. So what I'm getting at here is, if we were to look at verse 5, the ending of verse 5 has this same sort of ending as the ending of verse 3, sabba sattā bhavantu sukhitattā. We could think of this verse as going with, this entire verse as going with either one of those. Probably it makes sense even to put it with verse 5, and that will become apparent later. But even if we did put a period here, and by the way, I've seen this printed with different, with a semicolon where this period is, and I've even seen it printed with no punctuation whatsoever. Even if we were to just take this on its own and understand it between verses 3 and 5, it will make sense. Now, in the remainder of this verse, there are only two types of words. We're either going to find adjectives, which are masculine nominative plural, ending in this long A, or we're going to find the Pali word for or, namely va. And sometimes, due to the meter, it's shortened to va. And we're going to run into that in just a second. So our first adjective here that we find is tasā. Now, the main meaning of tasā is movable or mobile. But it also takes on the meaning of like trembling, like someone trembling in fear. And consequently, maybe someone who is weak. So you can see actually why having to commit to one word in a translation robs this of a lot of power. The beings here under discussion could be simply mobile beings or beings that are trembling because they exist in a state of fear. So then we have va. Now va works like cha. It's going to be a, va, b, va. And that would mean A or B. So we have this tasā, va, then we have thāvarā. And thāvarā is the opposite of tasā. It is masculine nominative plural, and it means immobile, and consequently rooted, firm, strong. And again, we start to see how one English word does not capture the range of meanings of the Pali. We could actually be discussing beings who are immobile. Maybe there are beings like that in the realms of existence that is samsara. But again, in a translation, it's hard to convey immobile and strong. Maybe rooted or something like that would do it a little better, but it still doesn't convey the full range. And that's why we, dear listener, are actually learning the Pali so that we can get as close as possible to the original teaching. Now, this last word here in this line, I mentioned that the va sometimes becomes va for reasons of the meter. Here we have vanavasesā. That really breaks apart into va, aṇukathūlā. It's not being, we're not getting a long A here, again, because of the meter. At least that's my understanding. Vanavasesā is the opposite of avasesā, which would mean a remainder. Vanavasesā means without remainder or without exception. Again, this is masculine nominative plural, this long A. So the point here is all beings without exception. you might think that that would be conveyed in the word sabbe, but it is just a testament to human ingenuity that we can get around such words as all. So the Buddha is being very emphatic here, all beings without exception. On the next line, we have another va, or, and then this yeva. You might think it's some sort of relative pronoun. Actually, in this case, it is not. It is simply the word eva when it comes after a word ending in a vowel. So it's just easier to say va yeva than va eva. So this is just our emphatic particle, our emphatic word eva, indeed. Dīghā, again, masculine nominative plural, long. And if you're familiar with the Dīghā Nikāya, those are the long discourses of the Buddha in the Sutta Pitaka. Mahantā, again, masculine nominative plural. This word, it means great. It is cognate with Greek mega and Latin magnus. And it also comes up in compounds quite often where it is, when it's the first part of a compound, it's maha, as in Mahayana, the great vehicle, according to Mahayanists. Majjhimā, middle. Either middle length or just middle sized. Rassakā. Now, rassakā is actually rasa, which means short, with the addition of this ka, which typically turns a noun into an adjective or turns something into an adjective. Here, it's already an adjective, so it's just the meaning is still short. And whether we want to attach great significance to the ka or simply understand it as something that was added due to the exigencies of the meter, that I leave to you, dear listener. And then we end with a compound. This actually is a dvanda compound, meaning that if we split this word into two parts, they would both be in the same case, and in this particular case, they would both be masculine nominative plural. But again, when the compounds are put together, the first case, we don't know the ending. We just get the stem. So we have aṇukathūlā. Aṇuka is actually just like rassakā before. You really have to look it up under anu. And I think if you look up aṇuka, you're redirected to anu, which means small, minute, atomic. And then that is contrasted here with the last part of the compound, thūlā, which means massive, coarse, big, strong, maybe bulky. Sometimes in older translations, you'll hear like gross, not as in something disgusting, but as in something big and bulky. This word comes up in Vedanta and in yoga practices where it's referred to as the stula sharira. Sharira is body, and stula is the Sanskrit form of this word thūlā, big. And sometimes you'll, again, encounter in translations the word gross.